Yeah, go
Okay.
ahead.
First of all, thanks for inviting me, Marcia. Thanks for that really kind introduction. I was flattered to be asked. I published that McCall book a long time ago, and I still enjoy talking about McCall all these years later. And one of the chapters of that story that I find most fascinating is the vaudeville. And so I was thrilled to actually get a chance to talk about it. People ask me, I was in my 20s. I'm a little older now, but I was in my 20s when I first launched into this book, and people wanted to know why. And it came down to this, that I'd grown up in Oregon. I had been in grade school when McCall was governor. Once I was out of college and was working as a reporter, McCall had died and people were questioning his legacy. And I wasn't sure that was the case, that his legacy seemed to me to be kind of fixed as a positive effect, but we were in a deep recession at the time. So I set off to write a few stories about what McCall's legacy was, and I realized that there was no book. In fact, I was standing in Powell's because, I wanted to get every possible book there was on Oregon history. Why go to the library where you can go to Powell's? And it was there I realized that there was no book about McCall, and I was off and running. I had a sense of his importance, having grown up here while he was governor, but a lot of it becomes kind of legend, and it becomes myth, and it kind of gets all blended together. And I wanted to sort of unpack it all. He was the most influential governor the state has had. He was a national leader for conservation and environmental awareness and legislation. He talked not about preservation, but about conservation in a way that eventually has become known as sustainability. He had a progressive bent, there's no question about it. Some of the landmark bills and changes he oversaw was the protection of Oregon beaches, land use planning and conservation, energy conservation, and perhaps the most famous one that we're going to talk about today is the bottle bill. I want to point out before we get too far that McCall was a Republican. He was the legacy of New England power and wealth. One grandfather had been congressman and governor of Massachusetts. The other grandfather was one of the wealthiest men in the country for a time, a notorious, what they called plunger rather, who committed as many frauds as he did anything else, but eventually became a hero to the public when he kind of turned on his cohorts, which included the Rockefellers, and ratted them out for all the frauds they committed. That dual legacy of both pursuit of public life and also the sort of the desire for public attention and love kind of defined the McCall family going forward. Tom McCall grew up in Central Oregon. He was born in Massachusetts, but grew up in Central Oregon on the Crooked River. Went here, University of Oregon, actually went here at the journalism school, became a newspaper reporter, and finally a broadcaster. He had political ambitions from the start. It kind of skipped a generation. His parents had very little interest in it, but he wanted to be congressman like his grandfather and governor like his grandfather. And when he was in college, he announced to his roommates and fraternity brothers that he was going to be president of the United States, which they thought was hilarious because he could barely get to class. He had a 2.01 GPA when he graduated, which was just enough to get there. But he had this sort of enduring appeal and this doggedness, if you will, to stay with issues and to stay with things that really did matter to him. I didn't know what I was going to find when I first started writing this book. The stories, as I said, had become kind of legendary, and they all been sort of blended together. And you sort of, with this biographer, if the person you're writing about has passed away, you kind of start at the obituaries, glorifying and all of that, and kind of had to go back and unpack what the story really was. I was lucky. By the time I started the book, McCall would have been 72. He had died 3 years earlier. So many of the people who had worked with him and served with him were still around. And so that was a great bit of fortune. the thing I remembered as a kid in Oregon was that he always seemed to be the source of really great ideas. We used to go water skiing on the Willamette, and my parents would say, couldn't used to do this. River was too dirty, and they would talk about McCall's being important with the cleanup. They actually credited him, but as we know from history, that he was one of many players, and that's kind of McCall's nature. He would get involved in things, he would adopt things, he would absorb issues, and become the person who cleaned up the Willamette, or the person who saved the beaches, when in fact there weren't any players. He had this insatiable desire to not claim credit, but happy to accept it. He did make a profound difference with the river. He wrote, as a broadcaster at KGW in Portland, 1962, he did this documentary called Pollution in Paradise. You can now see it on YouTube. It's an amazing bit of history. When you see it, you're stunned by how much pollution, how much air pollution, how much water pollution was unleashed on the air in Portland and other communities and in the river. And that film helped to turn things around for cleaning up, particularly with the Willamette. His argument was basically always this, that there's a trade-off when we pursue an industrial economic base, and that is we give up our livability. He pointed to places that had lost their livability and said it's not too late for Oregon to find a way to have both. He was most famous, I think, for trying to express that feeling and being frustrated that people weren't paying close enough attention. And he said, in effect, to the country, to the world, Oregon, it's lovely. Please come visit, but don't come here to live. And it became his trademarked statement. People thought he was trying to lock the doors, and really what he was saying was, we need time to prepare for the growth. And considering what, I'm not sure that even in McCall's era, they could predict the growth that Oregon saw, even though it was always growing at a very, very rapid pace. All this history I had to unpack. I thought the easiest one was going to be the bottle bill. I mean, it had become the famous landmark legislation. It had rid the state of millions of bottles and cans in litter along the roads and trails and the beaches. It started as an anti-litter measure, but it became a model for recycling. If you ask people today what that's all about, they would say, well, it's a recycling measure, but that wasn't even really discussed. It was all about cleaning up the streets, trails, and so on. It changed the state's reputation nationally because McCall was a magnet for press attention. He was a former journalist. He knew how to craft quotes. He knew how to draw people in, and the national press really loved him, and because he had a story to tell. And that really took off with the passage of the bottle bill in 1971. He became the bill's greatest champion. And you have to sort of picture him, if I can just sketch it for a moment. 6'5". His family said he was actually taller than that, but he claimed to be 6'5". A voice that was both Boston Brahmin and also Central Oregon flatness put together. He had learned eloquence, how to speak, and how to from his parents, with his father's Harvard education and the whole culture that they had come from, and really took language seriously, and worked very hard at sounding spontaneous. But his words and his language and his quotes were often memorable, and as a result, he drew a lot of attention, and he loved it. He really did. It wasn't so much the fame in the office, is that he had this desire for public adoration that kind of went beyond most politicians. And when people said, "You're the father of the bottle bill," he was happy to say, "Thank you." But there's nothing that historians and journalists love more than a hidden story, and that's what the bottle bill was for me. And I didn't see it coming. I knew that there were lots of other people involved, but the person who mattered the most to the bottle bill, other than McCall, was someone who was not known to people. There was no monuments named for him or parks, or it was barely mentioned in the press at the time, but the bottle bill wouldn't exist without him. I had originally thought this person that person who plays that role was going to be a guy named Paul Hanneman. Hanneman was a Republican state representative from Tillamook County. And he had introduced the original bottle bill in 1969. And everybody called him the originator of the idea. I covered Hanneman in the legislature. And if the bottle bill had been his great achievement, he didn't do all that much more in the rest of his career. That was the thing that he kind of rode on. And I figured, well, this guy, I knew him to be kind of a grump. At least that was my experience in covering him. But of course, I didn't ever really cover Tillamook County, so he never saw much use for me as a reporter. And I didn't really know how to approach him. I went to his office one day to talk to him about his legacy, thinking, well, this is his thing. He'll be known, always for the bottle bill. And I can still remember putting my tape recorder on his desk and him staring at it and looking at me and saying, you don't want to talk to me. I'm not the story. And I thought, well, this is not going to go well. He said, look, I've been called the father of the bottle bill, given the credit for it all these years. But the real guy you want to you find out about is a guy named Richard Chambers. And I thought he was just, I don't know what he was, deferring credit or I don't know, confused. I don't know what it was he was up to. Because I had never heard this name before. I'd spent 2 years, at least by this point, researching all of the legislation and all of the history of all these issues we're talking about, and didn't remember that name at all. I found out that Richard Chambers had passed away, and I found his wife and his brother and his daughter who were still alive. And I also then eventually got Paul Hanneman to talk to me. And what I realized was that this person who had been lost to history was suddenly emerging as a character in this book and as a key player, the key player in the history of this bill. So Chambers was a big hulking guy. He was a really great athlete growing up. He grew up in the Salem area. He loved all sports. But even if you go back to, he was probably in high school I would guess in the 40s would be my guess. He played handball of all sports, handball. And I asked his daughter, why was that? And she said, the other sports were fine, but if you were handball, it was just you. It was just you. You win or you lose, and you're accountable. His brother said Richard Chambers was always a solo guy. He was absolutely independent. No one could tell him what to do. He'd been enlisted in the Navy after high school. And when an officer berated him for not following regulations, Richard Chambers decked the officer with a single punch. He begged the Navy to give him a dishonorable discharge. They refused. He left and sailed the ocean as a merchant marine for a number of years. He eventually became a logging equipment salesman, raised a family in Salem, and basically a quiet life. The one thing he loved more than anything else was to be out hiking, mountains, along the rivers and the beaches that he and his family had a place at Pacific City at the Nestucca Spit. And he seemed determined to hike every possible trail in Oregon. Again, his daughter, Vicki, once told me that she could remember being so exhausted walking some beach someplace. And she said to him, this is when she was a young girl, she said, Dad, isn't this beach like all the others? And he said, well, maybe, but I've never seen this beach. And he would go on these trips. Sometimes his wife would drop him off in some end of some road someplace. And a week later, he'd show up somewhere else. He didn't know where he was going. They knew not to ask. He just was an adventurer, solo. And he always came back with a bag full of trash. No matter where he went, if it was for the day or overnight, wherever it would be, he took plastic bags and collected litter. It drove his family crazy that he would always come back and have these bags of trash. As his wife put it, litter just drove him wild. He would spread it out at the family table and try to determine what was here. And it was absolutely clear to him that most of it was bottles and cans. And he did this every time he hiked, every time. They were at their beach house in Pacific City on a Sunday morning. It was in 1968. And we can place the date because there was a newspaper story that got him incredibly excited. And it was a story about the British Columbia was considering banning non-returnable bottles and cans. And he got so excited, he picked up the phone and he called Paul Hanneman, now the legislature I was just telling you about. And it was 8 a.m. on a Sunday, and they knew each other, and he insisted that Hanneman come down to a crossroad in Pacific City. I think there's only like one intersection really there. And there was trash everywhere. There was just litter everywhere. And Hanneman recalls saying, you got me up at 8 o'clock on a Sunday morning to come down here and look at garbage. And Chambers said, no, look at it. What is it? It's mostly bottles and cans. And he said, we can stop this. And here's how. You just make it illegal for bottles and can companies not to take them back. I asked Hanneman, you're standing there at 8 o'clock in the morning and he's telling you this, and he says, you don't understand Rich Chambers. He says, when he suggested I do that, I had no other choice. And so he introduced the original bill. Nobody really knew what they were getting into. The whole notion of, for years, the idea that you would take your bottles and cans back was just part of the American way of life. It was local brewers and local bottlers. It was cheaper for them to wash out mostly the bottles and to reuse them. I mean, think about it, those of us who recall getting milk delivered, right? They always wanted to take the bottles back, same here. But as national brewing companies and bottlers started to grow, it became less efficient for those companies to take all these bottles and ship them back to wherever they were. And so they just stopped, with no deposit, no return. And that would allow them to undercut the prices of the local breweries. And it became an essential economic strategy to help keep, for these national brewers and bottlers to grow. But it killed the locals. I think the numbers were between 1950 and 1970, the number of soft drink plants that were local fell by half, from 6,000 to 3,000 in local breweries. Some of you may remember having those in your community. It fell from 400 to 160. Now, there were a lot of other factors too, but this was a big part of it. Now, in 1953, the state of Vermont actually did ban non-returnables, but they didn't apply a deposit. And after 4 years, the pressure got so intense from grocers, from companies, from all sorts of other political forces that they repealed the law. So no place had it yet. British Columbia was working on it when Hanneman introduced this bill. The companies had done a great job, by the way, of keeping all these kind of bills these efforts at bay. They had said, they started something called Keep America Beautiful. You might all remember those billboards and those campaigns. We all thought it was somebody being really nice and civic. It was a massive international bottlers and brewers trying to keep this kind of legislation out of the law books around the country. But nobody in Oregon really understood that. Nobody anyway, except Richard Chambers. He had done plenty of research. He had spent the 6 months or so between the time he suggested the bill be introduced and time the 1969 legislature opened, researching everything he could about the industry and how it worked and why bottles and cans were now no deposit and no return, whereas 25, 30 years ago, earlier, they hadn't been. He knew all the arguments that were coming. And so because he had written letters by the score to all the bottlers, brewers, all the associations, asking them what seemed to be very simple industry questions and a massive amount of data. So when they came in ready to argue against the bottle bill, he was able to provide Hanneman with the facts and statistics that rebutted almost everything they said. He also built a coalition, environmental groups, garden clubs, other community organizations, and he had done it with a letter writing campaign. Just to give you a sense of how infested he was, he wrote thousands and thousands of letters. He used brightly colored stationery. He traveled the world, so he had all the stationery from all over the place. And it was of all colors. He would type these letters in giant type. I don't know if anybody have ever seen a broadcast typewriter that types in big letters. He would even type the letters so that it was diagonal across the page, anything to get people's attention. As his brother said, if you got a letter from Richard Chambers, you didn't throw it away, you had to read it. And he built a coalition around this, and it began to grow. People went in and testified about river guides, about the litter they saw, and to the very, very early environmental groups that were working, were mostly local, not quite coalitions yet. Even when at one point Richard Chambers went into a legislative session and basically emptied out a bag of his trash and said, "Look, bottles and cans," and then handed them to the legislators. But they didn't know really what was coming. It was an intense lobbying effort, mostly from local bottlers and brewers that had a lot of money and that were already pretty well known to the legislators. And the bill was struggling. The House was controlled by Republicans, and the Republican leader were determined to kill this bill. It wasn't getting much press attention. But Hanneman convinced one member of the committee to vote for it, and before they knew it, it was called a runaway bill. It had gotten out of committee, it wasn't supposed to, now it was headed to the floor, and there was really no stopping it. But the pressure from the Republican leadership on their own members was growing. Hanneman needed an ally, and he went to Tom McCall. Now, they were both Republicans, and they didn't like each other. McCall was a favorite of moderate Republicans, and I want to repeat, there was once a thing called a moderate Republican. The conservative Democrats and moderate Republicans in Oregon would meet in the middle and work on and basically that's how the state got run. But he knew that McCall could sway people, and McCall said, "Yes, I will back this bill." In fact, McCall's office had been in favor of the bill from the start, but McCall had never really put any kind of big push. Hanneman said, "Okay, when I need you, please back it." Now he needed him. And McCall was kind of a no-show. He didn't really give a very strong endorsement. The bill got sent back to committee where it promptly died. McCall then sent a letter to the committee chairman saying, "Not the right time." And that really stunned Paul Hanneman. He thought he had the governor on his side. He felt betrayed. And he said, I'd hoped he would have stood up for me, stood up for the bill. He said the time wasn't right, and I disagreed, Hanneman told me, but it turns out he was right. A friend of mine I worked with for years in the state capitol, who's a reporter for United Press International, a guy named Don Jepson, got a hold of this letter and wrote a story about it. And he recalled interviewing McCall, and McCall was furious that Jepson was going to write about this. He said, "Look, we have a plan. If you portray me as the person who killed the bottle bill, plan might not work." Well, Jepson wrote the story, and he remembered how upset McCall was, and Jepson said, "You know what? He did have a plan," and it went like this. They knew they couldn't get the bill passed, and so they had a compromise, and one of the compromises was that the state would help form something called Stop Oregon Litter and Vandalism. Now, if any of you grew up here, you may remember SOLVE. In grade school, we had to make SOLVE posters, and we had SOLVE was the logo. It looked like a stop sign with SOLVE across it. And it was intended to clean, don't litter, keep your streets and beaches clean, and all of that. And we all thought it was, again, civic do-gooders. And it was actually, as a reporter for an alt weekly in Portland called the Oregon Times. I don't know how any of you remember Phil Stanford, but Phil Stanford broke the story that the industry had bankrolled SOLVE, and it was just an industry front. McCall knew this. He knew it all along, and he let the industry think that they were going to have, this was their strategy, that everybody was going to say, we just won't litter and that'll solve everything. And he let that string kind of play out. He was up for re-election in 1970, and he was struggling in the polls, but he knew that his opposition was a guy named Bob Straub. Robert Straub was the state treasurer. These two guys were both, one was 6'5", one was 6'4". They agreed on everything. And if anything, they pushed each other more toward conservation and environmental protections because they were competing for the governorship. McCall had beat Straub in 66, and Straub was actually very close in the polls by this point. McCall did what he did so many times, and he did really well. He basically kind of grabbed an issue. He had done it to Straub a number of times, but he did it with a bottle bill. In early 1970, the bottle and can industry thought that McCall was sort of put away and not going to be a problem on this. And then, without any warning, he gave a speech to a Salem Civic Club where he said, I want to make it very clear that there will be no quid pro quo in the form of a relaxation of my commitment to put a price on the head of every beer and pop can and bottle in the United States. It's quite something about that statement, the way it's the rhythm of it just kind of keeps drumming at you until finally he said every bottle and can in the United States, not Oregon, the United States. And this freaked out all of the industrial opponents to the bottom bill. This wasn't talking about that Oregon was, we had to kill it in Oregon. McCall was intending to make this a national issue. He had been invited, in fact, to the Oregon Washington Bottlers Association the following month. They were thinking, we have a nice, pleasant talk with the governor who is not going to fight us on this. And rather than giving him this pap speech, he, with some glee, stared them down and said the following. He said, the environmental crisis towers over us like a massive cresting wave. If we establish standards and hold to them, we resist engulfment and save ourselves and business from inundation, ocean to ocean, by bottles and containers. What happens in Oregon is going to set a precedent for the rest of the nation. We are the key state in what I feel will be a domino reaction. As the key domino, the way we move will set off a chain reaction. Well, this brought in not just local lobbyists, but national lobbyists into Oregon. McCall handily won election in 1970, was more popular than ever, and basically had an enormous amount of clout. He threw his full weight behind this bill, and the legislature filled up with lobbyists from all over the country trying to stop this. They were pretty ham-handed. I won't go into all of the details, but they just didn't get that Oregon was still a place where a logging equipment salesman could suggest an idea that would bring this much attention. And it didn't take money and power in order to introduce it, but they thought that maybe all of it would kill the bill. Even the Republicans who proposed it in 1969 were starting to get disgusted by how much pressure they were under to fight this bill. Washington State in 1970, by the way, had an initiative on the ballot. They were almost the first. They would have done exactly what the Oregon bottle bill was going to do. It had been so far ahead of the polls, and it ended up losing by 2 points because of this massive attack on it. Again, 1970, we're talking about the scale of things. It was a big attack, and everybody in the Oregon legislature knew that it was going to be even more pressure. The bill got out of the House, went to the Senate, at which point in time, the national lobbyists hired some of the local lobbyists to convey the message that anybody who voted against the bill could expect a $5,000 check for their campaign. Well, campaigns didn't cost more than a couple $1,000s, and the message was clear. This was a payoff, and state senators went to the floor of the Senate to reveal this, and any hope of the bill having any serious opposition died. Out of 90 legislators, only 14 voted against it. It was a sweep. The bill went into effect in 1972, and here's what it required: that every bottle and can have a 5-cent deposit on it, and that you could bring it back anywhere and get your money back. And you paid for it going out. And the only exception was there was a brewery in Portland, Blitz Weinhardt, which was very powerful. They had 11-ounce stubbies. It was only 2 cents for those. That was the concession. The companies were really worried that people were going to stop buying, or that the sales would go down. It didn't happen. They also tried to argue all along that the bottles and cans were not really a source of trash. In fact, there was a study. There was a lot of pressure on the Oregon Department of Transportation it was the Highway Department at that time, try to study the trash that was along the road. And the industry was insisting that every little scrap of paper, anything that even looked like trash, even roadkill, should be counted in the total that to reduce the amount that bottles and cans appeared, right? So a year after the bottle bill was passed, the EPA did a study and it said, even the most conservative estimates, that was about 2/3 of all the trash, about 62% actually was the number, of all the trash on the roadsides in Oregon were bottles and cans. 6 months after the bill was passed, it was 2%. From 62 to 2. And this was my personal experience. As a kid, growing up here, we would ride the school bus past what was then still kind of countryside, and you would see trash along the road. I can still remember there was one place in particular where a school bus turned. You would look down, you would just see trash all the time there. That was one year. Next year, you never saw it again. It was all gone. And that was what was being seen across the state. Now today, very few states have this legislation still. The efforts to fight it or to resist it has been pretty effective. I don't know the actual number. California's law works a little bit differently than other states. We, within the last few years, have passed big changes in the way bottles and cans are collected and increase in the deposits. Those reforms, by the way, were passed by Richard Chambers' daughter, Vicki Berger, who was elected to the Oregon House, and one of her major agendas was to make this bill work in the modern times. The bill that her father fought for. The bottle bill gave McCall a platform that helped turn him into a national figure. This was a calling card. And when the national press and other people started paying attention to Oregon as a model for any number of things, it always started with the story of the bottle bill. As I said before, McCall was happy to talk about it. He never claimed that he invented it, but as I said before, he never denied being the father. And it was, in some ways, that the foundation for all of the legacy, all the stories, all the myth making that went on. But there it was. It operated, and it continues to operate in one way or another, successfully or otherwise. The bottle bill has for all these years. And all of this time, the person who was most responsible just was never known. Richard Chambers was in the Senate, Oregon Senate, the day that bill finally passed. And when it was done, he got up and he walked out and he was done. He wasn't going to fight for any other issues. And people begged him to come work on bottle bill measures in other states. And he refused. And I'm quoting him here. He said, I accomplished what I set out to do. I don't give a shit what the rest of the world has done with its litter, because now Oregon has this bill. So 2 years after the bottle bill went into effect, he was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and his family begged him to write his story down. Tell your story to somebody, and he refused. He said, "It is nobody's business what I did, and nobody needs to know." And that's the way it was, with a couple of exceptions. When eventually people who were close to Chambers and were really involved in the bottle bill got to McCall and said, look, we need to do something to commemorate him. So in 1974, the state created an environmental award, and the first recipient was Richard Chambers. There's a photograph of McCall handing it to Chambers, and as far as I know, it's the first time they ever actually met. They might have talked before, but there's no indication of it. His family thinks this is the only time that he and McCall actually ever met. And McCall, who loved to talk, waxed on about the bottle bill and its greatness and its grandeur. And when it was Chambers' time to speak, he declined to say anything. He, a few days later, a report from this, I think it was the Statesman, finally got him to talk. And the only thing he would say was, I am in no way qualified to receive this award. And he died not too long after that. And he really wanted this way to be, left in anonymity. I talked to Vicki Berger, his daughter, just a couple months ago, and she said, I still have some doubts and regrets about having told you any of those things, because I love the fact that everybody knows that my father was the person, but he never wanted it. All he wanted, she said, was to not come back from a hike with bags of trash, bottles and cans. That was the only thing he wanted, and that's what he received. And that's the story of the bottle bill from that history. And I'm happy to take questions or talk about it, or pursue any of these other aspects. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the chance.
Thank you. That was really fascinating. Are there questions from the audience? Comments? Bob? And then Nicole.
Yeah, Brent, a question. I remember reading your book about McCall years ago, and it seemed to me that there was a lot of influence from his mom. Is my memory correct on that, and do you want to say anything about his mom's influence on him?
Oh yeah, it's very true. His mother was so his maternal grandfather was the flamboyant stock trader, multimillionaire. I mean, in the turn of the century, he was worth 40 million. I don't know what that calculates today, but it was a lot. Spent it all, lost it all. And eventually the family was kind of somewhat destitute. By this time, his mother had married the son of the congressman and the governor, who all he wanted to do was be a rancher out in Oregon, and that's what they did. They weren't very good at it. The sheriff would show up with warrants for their arrest for not paying bills, right? Meanwhile, they had these $20 gold pieces in their house, in their desk drawers, but they wouldn't spend them because they were given to them by the famous grandfather. Kind of eccentric types. The mother was particularly eccentric. She believed that whatever grandeur and fame her father had, just immediately, was bestowed on her. So here she was, this grande dame, if you will, of Boston, walking the streets of Prineville, kind of having her way sort of exerting whatever power and influence she thought. She read every night. She would read to the McCall kids from these amazing books, classics that their grandfather had purchased for them. And the way she performed and her diction and her eloquence, it all rubbed off on all of them, but particularly on McCall. But she was also fiercely competitive for the spotlight. And even though she was very proud of the fact that her son was governor, she constantly was trying to horn in on it. She would call him day and night. If she couldn't get him on the phone, she would call everybody else, state police, other politicians, trying to get the limelight, trying to get attention on her. There was at one point where McCall actually changed his phone number and ordered people not to give the phone number to his mother. And I heard the following story, and I thought it was a fiction, but it is not a fiction. One day the phone rings in the governor's office, and it's the White House. And there's a message from the President Johnson, to Governor McCall, and the message was, call your mother. She had called the White House, and she had badgered and harassed until the point where she got through to the President of the United States. And I thought this was a myth. I thought this was but she claimed she had done it, and nobody believed her until actually the call came through. And I still doubted it until one day I got a package of records from the Lyndon Johnson Library, just typical correspondence. And at the bottom of one, said, P.S. Tom had a nice talk with your mother, in the president's handwriting. So that's what she was like.
Oh my God.
Thank you, Brent.
What a story. Okay, Nicole.
Yeah, thanks for that great talk. So you mentioned interviewing the daughter, but this true originator of the bottle bill, how did you uncover his story if he didn't want it told? And then I'm also curious, can you just talk a little bit about how McCall, as the governor at that time, fit in with the rest of the governors sort of across the country? And was he a real still progressive in terms of the environment, or was this becoming more of a trend across the US?
Great question. So Vicky and her mother and her uncle knew that Richard Chambers didn't want the story told, but they did not ever agree with that. And they just thought it was so important that it was out there. So I called her mom and talked to her for a while, called the uncle, talked to him, called Vicky, called the mom, kept talking to them until finally, they they weren't reluctant to talk, but I think they were sort of pulling back all these stories. And in the end, they painted a portrait that was unforgettable. I don't think any of them ever really regretted having done so, because I think it was really important that their father's work, be known, because he would have disappeared entirely from history otherwise. And so, in the end, they were happy that it happened. But when she said to me, she was, "Yeah, Dad knew, he wouldn't be happy, but I'm glad we did it." The other governors at the time, the Republicans suffered, lost a lot of governorships in 1970 during the first term of the Nixon administration, and many of them were middle of the road or moderates. The governor of Washington, Dan Evans, and in particular was an ally of McCall. But McCall stood out because he was unafraid to speak out against the president, even among Republican governors, and the vice president, Spiro Agnew. And the party didn't matter to him as much as the importance of sort of speaking the truth, or whatever else was on his mind whenever somebody put a microphone near him. So it was he was a moderate among them. I mean, he was moderate, but that wasn't unusual. What was different is that he was willing to speak out. Al, hi Al.
Oh, yeah, go ahead, Al. And then Randy Painter also had a comment to make. So go ahead, Al.
Just, I guess, a point of personal privilege. Brent, it's good to see you again.
You too, Al.
In a previous life, I was actually on the State and Federal Affairs Committee in the Oregon House in 1971, and was privileged to carry the bottle bill in part on the floor of the House. And I think one of your summary was just superb, Brent. But there's a couple of three people I'd like to mention from the legislative side that were enormously important in the down and dirty fighting in terms of committee and putting together the majority against the big money that came into the state. Gordon Mcpherson was a Republican legislator and attorney from Walport, and he was with Paul Hanneman from the beginning on the bill. And he was enormously effective in working with the Democrats. And he told the story to us that, look, these folks came in after 1969 and said, don't worry, we're going to work on the litter, we're going to take care of this stuff. And then Gordon would come up to us and he would show us an article that appeared 1 month after the 69 session adjourned, where the folks who were promoting non-returnable packaging were going to spend tens of millions of dollars promoting it. And he said, he came to us as Democrats and said, look, don't listen to these guys. They're lying to you. And we need to basically hold hands and stand up against the money together. And that was impressive to me. I was a 24-year-old kid, and it was impressive to me that they would reach out. And that then also was also a Betty Roberts was very, very effective in the state Senate from that same regard, and Bill Gwynn from Albany. And the combination of all of these Republican and Democratic voices standing up against the out-of-state money was really, it complemented what Rich Chambers was working on. And I just wanted to just toss those names out there.
No, I appreciate that. You know, I didn't go too much into detail into the all back and forth with the legislature. It was quite a battle. And there were a couple of Republicans who became quite famous later who, to their unending embarrassment, you know, had fought that bill, you know, initially and fought to kill it. But Betty Roberts, I spent a long time talking to her about her efforts, and she was targeted for a lot of reasons. She was the chair of the Senate committee, I believe, Al, if I remember right. And all of the opponents tried every trick they could to try to trip her up. And she was steadfast. But yeah, she was fantastic on that bill.
Thanks, Al. Brandy, and then Joshua Burstein has a comment to make too. Go ahead, Brandy.
I already put it in the chat, but it's just a comment. I remember the plaid pantry stores up in the Portland area, their convenience stores. They were very supportive of the bottle bill, and they had, you know, collection weekends or collection periods where they were taking in cans and bottles at 2 cents each, you know, before there was a deposit, just for the good or test marketing, or I don't know what their angle was, but I remember they were supportive of a bottle bill.
That's exactly right, and I'm glad you mentioned. I actually had it in my notes, and I in the concern for time, I left it out. But John Passantini was a businessman who started Plaid Pantry, and he had gone up against the big grocery stores. And when all the grocery stores were saying this can't be done, he says, "Yeah, watch me." And you're right. He gave people 2 cents back on bottles and cans, even though they'd not paid the deposits. He said, "I hope the state buries me in trash, or in bottles and cans rather," and they did. And he stood by it. He became single-handedly kind of undermined the argument that it wouldn't work. And so I'm glad you mentioned him. Yeah.
That's kind of amazing. Okay, and so Josh.
Sure. Hey, thanks, Marcia. And I also put in the chat, or for those who didn't see it, a reference to a kind of, I almost call it future science fiction novel, if you will, called Mcpherson, which I believe the Eugene Public Library has, and I just checked something like $4 on Amazon, by Claire Hall, who now is a Lincoln County Commissioner and also former journalist.
Right.
I am a transplant too to Oregon. I've been here 13 years, but I tell people, at least my wife grew up here, but actually she wasn't even born here, so she's not a native. But I'm a history geek, so I love these talks. I thank everyone who's involved in them, and Brent, thank you for this. I'll add one more thing to my comment, if I may, which is, gosh, a few years ago, I think either Claire or the publisher came out with new bumper stickers that said for McCall. So like if you'd have like a Biden Harris bumper sticker on your car or something like that. And I have on my, how old is my 19-year-old Civic or something, a McCall bumper sticker, which kind of makes no sense because I wasn't even around here in Oregon when he was governor. But I feel like it's part of our shared history. And so I wanted to mention that as well. And if any of you haven't seen that book, I think it's worth a read. It's fun. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for that. Either John or Teresa has a comment that I thought you might share with others.
Yeah, with so much success in reducing litter, like you said, 62% of the roadside litter to 2%. Why didn't more states jump on their own bottle bill?
That's a really good question. And I didn't spend a lot of time looking at that, as part of the research for the book. I think Oregon took the industry completely by surprise. And I don't think they were really ready. And they certainly weren't very sophisticated about it. And given that Oregon had a successful track record, and there had been lots of studies, there was just a lot of resistance. Again, I don't know the current number. I mean, there were a whole bunch of states that followed, like several, a handful, and then it's been kind of a few, and there's probably no more than 10. And I don't know the reason, except that I think they were simply far more effective at arguing against it and having learned lessons from Oregon. There was efforts, I'm trying to remember if it was Senator Hatfield or Packwood, Oregon senators, U.S. senators, tried to do national bottle bill legislation, and that went nowhere because of the pressure.
Al, you had another comment?
I just would give a little anecdote that illustrated Brent's point, perhaps. In one of the hearings, we had a representative from the American Can Company come to testify on the bill. And he gave us each a card, and it said Corporate Executive Vice President, Environmental Affairs. And so I said, how long have you had your job? And he said, a week. And so I said, then I could assume that your company's interest in this is recent.
That's pretty good. That's pretty good.
Well, I want to add something, that I had an undergraduate some years back, maybe within the first couple of years that I was here, so maybe 8 years ago, who wrote a paper on the bottle bill, and another one who wrote one at the same time on the beach bill. Now I'm wondering how much might have been loosely plagiarized from your book, because I recall that she focused on Chambers a lot, but one of the things but she did go into McCall's papers in the archives and, really made a convincing argument that nonetheless, McCall should receive a lot of credit for this because of that journalistic skill of shaping the message and just being willing to hammer that message home publicly all the time. So if you could comment on that.
No, that's exactly right. When McCall kind of burst out in the beginning of 1970, as he became overnight the leading voice for this idea. It had been a popular idea. I mean, as crude as public opinion polling was at the time, there was like 1 or 2 pollsters and working in the state. Really, there was a clear sense that this was popular and it was gaining support. And when he burst out as the spokesperson for it, that's exactly right. He had done that before. He had done that on the beach bill when people had, the legislature had hesitated about reinforcing the public protections. He had done it on a number of other issues. And he would go on to do it on a number of others. And so he did own an enormous amount of, he did deserve a lot of credit for it. And Richard Chambers was absolutely fine to let him have it. There was not any tensions there, but it was a model for how McCall worked. He understood the sentiment of the public. He could see which way things were going. He did know the right moment to pull back and then to spring back. He told my old friend Don Jepson, the reporter, saying, well, I have a plan. He had a plan. And that was enormously important.
Randy, did you have more that you wanted to say, or if I just?
It's in the chat.
Okay. Makes it part of the record, but fine. Any other questions or comments? You can just speak up if you do, or raise your hand, either way.
Just wanted to say how interesting this presentation was.
Thank you.
Yeah, I've only been here 28 years. I didn't know most of this. So yeah, very interesting. Thank you so much.
You bet. You're welcome.
Other comments? Bob?
I was just going to make one other observation. Brent referred to it earlier when he talked about, there actually were moderate Republicans, back then. One of those quite reviled Republicans at this point is Richard Nixon. Yet, when the question was asked about other governors and environmentalism, Nixon gets credit for the EPA. So, there was other interest, and things have evolved since then, and I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Sarah.
Hi, I too really enjoyed this so much. I've been here 30 years and I knew some of it, but not all of it. And I was at a family reunion in northern Idaho this weekend, or not this weekend, this summer. And the trash and the bottle beer and, you know, all those cans going into the garbage. And, you know, I have brought, my sister lives up there, and I have brought, you know, boxes full of their cans home to recycle them, and I give the money to wonderful places, you know. So, yeah, it's a problem all over the United States.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah. And this is one of the many ways in which, I mean, Oregon, I believe, has long been a leader. And I will point to the beach bill about this, that, you know, we were also the first state to declare the beach up to the wet line, basically, to be public. And it's California that then has followed our model. We oftentimes think of California as being in the forefront of a lot of this, a lot of environmental law, but I think that the record shows that oftentimes it's been Oregon first, and then California has followed our lead, and it's something I think we can all be very proud of, and hopefully we can continue to lead in that way in the future. So, are there any other comments or questions of Brent? Yes, Al.
Just want to mention one other bill that we made law in 1971 that also has a torturous history and is unique in the country, and that's the bicycle bill.
Right.
Don Stathos, a fellow representative from Jackson County, and I worked on that one together, and that has been a model for a truly remarkable mode allocation in Oregon with regard to bicycles and pedestrian paths and the like. And that was done in the same year.
Wow.
Yep, the bike bill, absolutely. It's all true. It has had a huge lasting effect. We take it for granted now, but I can remember bike lanes going in right after that. So
Kind of amazing.
yeah.
And again, under Republic, you know, back in the day, environmental laws were considered very bipartisan. It was a middle of the road kind of thing that you could do while we were in a very divisive war and had other divisive racial issues similar to today. But people felt like they could agree about cleaning up the environment. That's why Nixon could take the lead in a way that was not at all controversial at the time, but that he was, or had less, it was less controversial at least than similar laws would be today. So I wish we could have that kind of leadership again from on the Republican side of the aisle. Any other questions or comments? Sure, we covered everything.
Marcia, do we want to say something about future programs?
Why don't you do so? Go ahead.
Well, the next dates will be November 8th and December 13th. And I believe that November 8th is to be determined. And it looks like December 13th will have at least two of the three authors of three eminent Oregonians about, oh boy, who are the three eminent Oregonians? There's Jesse Applegate, there's Richard Neuberger,
And Abigail Dunaway.
Abigail Dunaway.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yep. So we advertise again on the Lane County History Museum website and on the History Department website. You can sign up in both areas to make sure you get alerts, I think. And then also we advertise in the Eugene Weekly on the Thursday before the History Pub Talk. So look there to find out what's on the November agenda. I have yet to secure that speaker, but we'll be doing that soon and putting out the publicity as soon as possible. So thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.